everybody. Welcome to Godly Play and the continuing stories about John Wesley. Now, I wonder if any of you have ever read any of these books called Who Was or Who Is. We actually have one of these books in our Godly Play classroom. It's called Who Was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. About a week ago, I was over at Barnes & Noble, and I was just kind of wandering around looking at books, and I found a whole shelf, a shelf that went from the floor all the way to the ceiling of these books about who was or who is. Now, there were books about who was George Washington and who was Abraham Lincoln and who is Michelle Obama and who is Oprah Winfrey. The books that are called Who Was are about people who are not living anymore, and the books that are called Who Is are about people who are still living. So I picked up a couple of the books that I thought I might be interested in learning about. This one is called Who Was H.J. Heinz. And the reason that was interested in this one is because this man, Henry Heinz, started his business in Pittsburgh many years ago. And he's famous for making Heinz ketchup and Heinz mustard and Heinz 57 sauce. And I was just kind of interested in learning more about him and his company. And I finished that book, and I did learn a lot about him, and I learned a lot about what he did in Pittsburgh. Now, this book is called Who Is Malala Yousafzai. Now, this one's called Who Is because Malala is still living. She's a young woman, probably in her early 20s. And I was interested in reading about her because I've seen her on the news many times, and I know she's a very brave young woman, and I was interested in learning about her story. I haven't finished this book yet, so I'm gonna read this one, and I'm gonna learn more about Malala. Well, you're probably wondering now, what does all that have to do with John Wesley? Well, Miss Helen started the story of John Wesley last week, telling us about his family, and I'm going to tell you some things today about John Wesley's early life, his childhood and his early education. And while I was thinking about these stories, I got this idea that by the time we finish the stories of John Wesley, we're going to know so much about him that we could write our own book called Who Was John Wesley? So I started a little book cover here, that says Who Was John Wesley at the top, and it has a picture of John. But I don't know, we're gonna have to jazz it up a little bit to look kind of like these. I might need one of you really good artists to help me with some of that. And then I got this idea that I could make this what I'm thinking of as my chalkboard here, where I could keep track of the stories about John Wesley, and I could sort of make those into chapters. So last week, Miss Helen told us about John's family, and I thought, well, that sounds like that could be chapter 1 of the Who Was John Wesley book. And we learned about John's father, Samuel, who was a pastor in England. And we learned about his mother, Susanna, who took care of the home and the children. And we're going to hear a little bit more about her today. And then Miss Helen told us about some of John's brothers and sisters. And remember, there were 19 children in the family altogether, but only 9 of them lived into adulthood. And I was thinking that, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this at all. This is why we're going to have to practice here with my chalkboard. But I was going to use Sour Patch Kids, 9 of them, to represent the Wesley children. Now, today we're going to hear more about John's childhood and his schooling. And I thought, well, that makes up chapter 2 of our book called Who Was John Wesley? So let's get started and let's hear some stories about John's childhood. Okay, the first story I'm going to tell you about John Wesley's boyhood took place when John was about 5. John lived with his parents, Samuel and Susanna Wesley, and 7 brothers and sisters in the town of Epworth, which is in England. And we're going to look at that on a map maybe later on in our stories, our storytelling. So remember, Miss Helen told us last week that Samuel and Susanna Wesley had 19 children altogether, but not all of them lived much past being very young. So when this story takes place, there were 8 children in the Wesley family. Now, before I start the story, I want to warn you that this story might be a little bit scary. Now, I will tell you that everything is fine at the end of the story, but it could be a little scary. So if you want to, you could call your mom or dad to come and watch it with you. Remember back, maybe a month ago, we talked about Pentecost and we talked about fire. And I told you that fire could be a really good thing, really helps us keep warm and cook our food and provides light. But fire can be very dangerous too, and that's what makes this story kind of scary. So when John was 5, he was living with his parents and his 7 brothers and sisters. The children mostly slept in one big room called the nursery on the 2nd floor of the house. And most of the other things in the house went on on the 1st floor. So one night, late at night, the children were all in bed in the nursery. Susanna had gone to bed, but Samuel was up working or reading or something. And all of a sudden, he heard a strange noise. And then out of the corner of his eye, he saw a strange light. And it turned out that there was a fire in the house. And the fire was on the 2nd floor of the house. So my little house here is supposed to look like there are flames coming out of the windows of the house. So Samuel was very upset, but he knew he had to act quickly. And he went and he woke Susanna. And together they went to get the children so that they could get them all out of the house. And in the meantime, some of the neighbors also saw what was happening, and they came running too to see if they could help. So I'm gonna have to work on getting some little people that I can use in my stories, like the wooden people we have in our Godly Playroom. But for today, I'm going to use goldfish as people. So Samuel and Susanna rushed to the nursery, and they got the children out of the nursery and brought them over to safety. Susanna stayed with the children, and then some of the neighbors came, and Susanna called to Samuel and she said, "Samuel, I only have 7 of the children here. John is missing." And of course, Samuel was very upset that any of the children would still be in the house. So he went back to the house. The fire was still burning in the house, and he didn't have time to go and get a ladder to get up to the 2nd floor to get John out. And in the meantime, the fire was inside the house. John couldn't get down the stairs to to let himself out. He tried to get out the window, but it was too hard for him to push the window open so he could get out. So the neighbors thought, well, how are we going to get up to the top, up to the second floor window to help John get out of the house without a ladder? So what they ended up doing was, one of the men stood on the shoulders of the other men, and you know, the men in real life were taller than goldfish, so they were able to reach up to the second floor with one standing on the shoulders of the other and push open the window, and there was John right near the window, and they were able to grab John and bring him down to safety. And Samuel took John over to Susanna and the rest of the children so Susanna could be reassured that John also was okay. So once the fire was put out and they knew that everybody in their family was safe, they thanked God for keeping them all safe. And Susanna turned to John and she said, "John, you must be a brand plucked from the burning." A brand plucked from the burning. And since Susanna knew her Bible very well, this was a verse that came from the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. And what it meant was that sometimes when something seems like it is going to be a total disaster, something unexpectedly good will come out of that disaster. And that's what Susanna meant when she called John a brand plucked from the burning. She was so grateful to God for saving John, and she believed with all her heart that God had saved John for some very important reason, and that he would do something very important in his life. Ready? Okay, back again. A couple things I want to tell you to finish up the story of the fire that John Wesley was in when he was a boy. First of all, I'm not nearly as good of a Bible scholar as Susanna Wesley is, because I made a mistake when I talked about the verse where she called John a brand plucked from the burning. That Bible verse really comes from the Old Testament book of Zechariah, not the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. So we might want to look that up in our Bible when we're all back together in the Godly Playroom. And the second thing I want to tell you about the fire story is that there is a video, a cartoon video of the fire story that you could see with your parents on YouTube. And if you search for something called Torchlighters John Wesley, you would see a cartoon of the story of John when he was a boy. Now, the second part of chapter 2 that I want to tell you about John Wesley is just a little bit about how he went to school. So in those days, and remember, John was born in 1703. That would make him 317 years old if he were still alive today. So in those days, in the 1700s, children were, for the most part, were taught at home. They went to school at home. I bet that sounds kind of familiar to you because a lot of you have been going to school at home for a little while now. Anyway, Susanna Wesley, the mother of all the children, was the teacher too. She must have been very, very busy taking care of the house and the children and also being the teacher of the 8 children. And she taught a lot of different subjects: English, history, geography, math. She also taught them Bible studies, what you might call religious studies. And they had to learn to say They had to learn to read from the Bible. They had to learn to say the Lord's Prayer, recite Bible verses from memory, say prayers, and pray for their family members. Okay? Then, when those things were done, they would go to family devotions. That was part of the school day too. One of the other subjects they learned, and I bet Miss Helen will be able to teach us a lot about this, but they learned to speak Latin. Now, Latin is kind of an old-fashioned language, not a language that many people learn today, not like Spanish or Chinese or German or something like that. But Latin can be a very useful language because many of the words in other languages are derived from original Latin words. So if you understand Latin, it might be easier to understand the definitions of words in English. And the reason Miss Helen could tell us a lot about this is because Miss Helen's mother was a high school Latin teacher. And I think that Miss Helen and her brother and sister had to learn Latin when they were younger too. So anyway, John had a very full school day learning all these different subjects, but his most favorite part of the school week came on Thursday. So Susanna Wesley, no matter how busy she was with home and teaching activities, she set aside 1 hour each week to spend just with one child at a time. It was their special time with each child and Susanna. And John especially really looked forward to this 1 hour week that he had with his mother, just all by himself. And they could talk about anything that they wanted to, and anything that he might have been having trouble with in school, or anything that he was especially interested in and she could help him with. And he really looked forward to these times. And I wonder if you can understand that. I wonder if any of you have special time that you spend with one of your parents, or maybe both of your parents, and you really enjoy that time when you get just one-on-one attention. Believe it or not, in a lot of workplaces, employees are encouraged to have one-on-one meetings with their boss, or where they can talk about things they're doing on their job, or questions that they have, or things that they need help with. And adults really like that one-on-one time too. So that was kind of interesting to me that was one of John's favorite parts of the week. So education was really, really important in the Wesley household. We can see that already. When John was 11, he went away to a boarding school called the Charterhouse School, and he continued his education there. And a boarding school is a school where you go away, and not only do you go to school, but you live there too. You don't live at home with your family. And they still have boarding schools today. Most of the children I know still live at home and then go to school right in their community. But they still have boarding schools where the children will go away and from their families and live at the school too. Then, so John went for several years to the Charterhouse School and continued his education. And then when he was 17 years old, he started going to school at Oxford University. And this is when he started his college education. And again, he was very serious about his studies in college, but he enjoyed other activities too, like tennis and dancing and reading and going to the theater. So he got a little combination of studying and having a good time too. But he was at Oxford and studying, and again continued all his religious studies until 1727. That was 7 years at Oxford University. And in 1727, he was called he was called into the ministry and went back to the town where he had grown up, Epworth, in England, to help his father, his father Samuel, who was a pastor, in his ministries. So that's the end of chapter 2. Next week we're going to hear some more stories and about John and his early adulthood and some of the things he did in his ministry. And maybe after we hear those stories, we'll be able to write chapter 3 in our book. Bye for now, and talk to you soon.